Who's to blame for all that stuff that happens in your life? Who's responsible? Well, you know, the basic logic of our society seems to put the blame on someone for what happens. People seem to require what might be referred to as a cause and effect premise for everything that happens in our lives, often requiring kind of a cause to be blamed for every effect. Well, welcome to Morning Walk. I'm glad you've joined me this morning for another discussion of our walk of faith as we consider the subject of blame. You know, we've all done it. We've often required someone to be blamed for the events that have occurred in our lives or the things that we have witnessed that have occurred to others. Whether that cause is something mechanical that happens at work where there's a failure, something breaks down, we want to troubleshoot it and we want to find out what the mechanical failure was and what's to blame for it not working. Or whether it's to blame someone for personal failure. Someone didn't measure up, someone didn't perform the way they were expected to perform. And so when it comes to the latter, that is blaming people, the cause and effect premise shifts essentially to an evaluation of a person's character. You know, to determine whether or not it was good or evil. And if it was good, then we kind of give them a pass. And if it was evil, then we blame them for a lack of proper character. However, since all character is actually derived from either God or Satan, often when there's failure, when there's something or someone that we look to blame, often God gets blamed for ultimately allowing things to happen that are negative in our lives. In other words, a lot of times people want to know, well, why did God allow that to happen? He could have stopped that from happening. So, is God ultimately to blame for things? Isn't God sovereign? Isn't He in control of everything? Well, people ask, as I've already said, why did God allow bad things to happen? If He's a good God, why doesn't He just allow good things to occur? Well, let's see if we can understand this. Well, it is true that God is the essential cause of all things. We would certainly admit that, wouldn't we? Because He is the creator of all things. And so He's essentially the cause of all things. But it's important that we recognize that He is never the blameworthy or the culpable cause of evil or those bad things that you're thinking about right now. Because to attribute evil or bad to God would be contrary to God's good character. In other words, it's not consistent with who He is. And so people seem to be unaware or maybe unwilling to accept the premise of divine providence or divine mystery. In other words, we don't understand all things, do we? No. We don't understand what God is doing often in our lives, and we have a hard time accepting the fact that a lot of things are beyond our human logic, beyond what we can properly understand by the principle of cause and effect. We want to figure it all out, don't we? We want to have a reason for everything. And we have to acknowledge that our finite understanding will never comprehend the infinite ways of God. So that's important. As the scripture says, his ways are past finding out. And so our human logic is not going to be able to figure out what we might call God's logic. It's just not going to happen. And so we must beware of the humanistic premise that elevates the human mind to such a degree that we become the arbitrator of truth in reality, that we think that we can figure it out when in reality we can't. And so when we do that, we kind of do away with the divine omnipotence, and we replace the reality of who God is with our own human reasoning, which would be very humanistic, wouldn't it? So we need to recognize that mankind, that we as human beings are seeking to blame someone for what's happening in our lives, and we're often unwilling to accept responsibility or blame ourselves. Now, I'm not really purporting that you blame yourself, but what I'm suggesting is that instead of seeking to identify someone to blame, just like Adam and Eve sought to blame each other at the fall, many seek to blame another person for the events or the actions that they find in their lives. And they seek to essentially get off the hook of responsibility for their own personal choices, for their own actions. Think with me a moment. Blame is an attempt to kind of balance the scale. Blame is an attempt to balance personal guilt. I feel some responsibility. I don't really want to take that responsibility. And so I blame something or someone to kind of deal with the guilt that I'm struggling with, so that it might feel justified. But the reality is that justification is righteousness, and righteousness is a person. His name is Jesus Christ. And so let me encourage you this morning, don't blame when things go wrong, as they sometimes will, and they certainly will. But instead, receive the full forgiveness of Christ's righteousness as yours, and recognize that stuff happens, and you don't always have to have it figured out. And that Christ is sufficient, even in the midst of the things that occur. And receive his grace and walk by faith, learning to accept the realities of the things that you don't understand.